about raising awareness, right? We have a little less than 90 minutes. So this is a conversation meant to begin to raise awareness on steps that can be taken, but unfortunately, what I will give you today will not fix it. You won't walk out of here feeling, revived, refueled. You might get a little bounce in your step, which is the goal, but that has to get maintained, so we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the keys to think about is kind of the more we feel overwhelmed setting in, the more diligent we have to be about planning on how to manage that. And we're going to talk a lot about that today too. The reason I passed out the handout, right, is it's a battery. And I think it's an easy way to think about what capacity you have as individuals. So kind of throughout the session today, maybe take some notes, mentally take some notes, whatever it is for yourself, on where you are in kind of the charge level and what fuels or drains the battery that you have, because that's really the things we can control within the world of compassion fatigue. And what you'll notice today is I'm going to talk a lot about taking care of ourselves and the individual factors that go into this, because it is what we can control. So I want to acknowledge before we start all of the things out there that we can't, right? Charity was just talking about the past year or two probably has been exceptionally challenging maybe in the course of your career. I hear that from a lot of my clients in a variety of different areas of law, not just immigration. But so societal, political, cultural things that happen drain us, they impact us, right? And at the same time, there's very little we can do to change that tomorrow, right? You can chip away at things over time. It's what you guys are doing. But it's not something that we have kind of complete control over. So that's important to acknowledge. It is something that will be draining, but it's not something that you can necessarily change today. So I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring the world out there. I am not in any capacity. I know it makes your jobs and your lives incrementally and immensely harder. It is just thinking about the things that we can actually do. Does that make sense? All right. So, well, that was what I was supposed to click on. We were checking in. And I just enjoyed it. So we're also going for a little bit of humor, right? Humor is very useful when it comes to compassion fatigue. Humor is just useful in life in general, but it is very useful in compassion fatigue. I want everybody to take a moment and answer these questions for yourself. You don't have to do it out loud. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot. You can share if you want to, but it's important to kind of know how we're feeling and thinking about life in terms of knowing how to care for ourselves. So I want to do this before we jump into the meat of the presentation. Anybody want to say how it was for them? You don't have to share what it was that you filled out, but anything that jumped out at you or surprised you or was consistent?
I think just like generally, I feel like I'm consistently like inconsistent on how I would answer these questions depending on what day, what hour,
yes,
how much of a break I got over the weekend, that kind of thing.
That's a great observation. Thank you. So essentially that the answers will change depending on how you feel that day, which is really important. And that's actually one of the reasons this is up here. One of the tools we'll talk about later is checking in with ourselves, right? And this can actually be a great way to do it. It's a little more formal, but sometimes we need formal to know kind of what questions to ask ourselves. So whether it's something you do daily, weekly, however often it is, do a self-check-in and, okay, where am I on this? Am I comfortable with the answers that I have, or am I a little bit uncomfortable with the answers I have? If I think the world is a dangerous place, and life is difficult, that's information. And maybe I need to figure out what to do with that information. There's no judgment in any of the answers. It's just data points for you to do something with at a later time. Any questions?
I'm just going to add that we have emailed the slides and your handouts to everyone. But if you don't find them in your email or you need them again, just email us and we'll send them again.
So this is kind of my summary of sometimes how compassion fatigue feels. It's just that feeling of like, I just can't anymore. So you can have a day like this, right? That's completely normal. It's when days become weeks, which become months, which become years, where we really start to get concerned. If you can bounce back after a day of two of feeling like a burrito, great. You have the tools, that help you cope. If you're not bouncing back from feeling like this, that should be a warning sign. Right? So the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. This is the reality of the deep impact of the work you do and the reality of what you're exposed to. It's really just laying the groundwork for the conversation we're going to have. And it's the importance of normalizing the experience that everybody has with it. All right, so we're going to talk about some foundational pieces. So you've got burnout. In the handout that you all will have a copy of, there is a good checklist, which you will have, of signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. And I'm building to that. Burnout is a building block of compassion fatigue. But it'll talk about kind of physical signs, behavioral signs, and psychological signs if you want to go a little more in depth. And there's also a quiz in there that really helps you break apart whether it's burnout or compassion fatigue, because they are different. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. Burnout is a gradual process. We often don't see it until it's really big. It's kind of the idea of a frog in boiling water, right? If it's in cold water and you start to turn up the heat, it never jumps out. But if you throw the frog into hot water, it typically jumps out right away. Not the nicest image now that I think about it, but an accurate metaphor on kind of what burnout is. So it really is this kind of gradual process that happens to us over time. It's often a precursor or a risk factor to compassion fatigue, but burnout alone is not compassion fatigue, right? So in self-disclosure, I am married to an attorney, but he does investment management, right? So he can experience burnout. That's highly possible, and I think I've seen it in my years with him. But he's not likely to experience compassion fatigue because he's not dealing with kind of the human suffering, the caring for others in the same way that immigration attorneys are, family law attorneys are, criminal attorneys are. So it's just an important distinction to make. So burnout kind of happens, and then there's another layer on top of that when we talk about compassion fatigue. You're going to hear compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. They are often used interchangeably, and there's also secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress are typically kind of the four different terminologies you'll hear thrown around. They're often used very interchangeably in the literature, but there is a distinction that some literature makes a distinction and some doesn't. So this is the reason I'm making a distinction, just so you kind of know what people say. But most often when you hear it, it'll be very kind of similarly referenced. What they talk about, the difference between vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, is with vicarious trauma, you often get, it's the trauma part in terms of for you. You get intrusive images, intrusive thoughts. You might have bad dreams. Your startle response will be very high. So it's as if, the trauma's happened to you and you are reacting to the trauma. And that's the vicarious trauma distinction. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? But today we'll basically be using them interchangeably because I think it's very nuanced, the difference, but the main difference is those intrusive thoughts and imagery that can happen. And then compassion fatigue. So it's the cumulative physical, emotional, psychological effects of continual exposure to traumatic or distressing stories or events when working in a helping capacity and where demands typically outweigh resources. So that bottom one is where the burnout comes in, right? So demands outweighing resources is what you often see in burnout. The helping capacity and the trauma exposure are where the compassion fatigue component come in. That's what moves it from burnout to compassion fatigue. And it's essentially a cost of caring for others. It happens in most any helping profession that experiences trauma, where you witness the suffering of others. So as a therapist, it is definitely something that I've had to be conscious of and work through over time. All right. Any questions? Yeah. We have a question up front.
Come all the way up front. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. You might be getting to this
Yeah.
later, but I was wondering if you could discuss how empathy plays into all of this.
Yep.
Because I think a lot of us went into this field because we feel a lot of empathy for our clients, for the work, or for people in general. And then we have to struggle with sort of having those boundaries, and it's not something that you want to turn off, but then sometimes you kind of have to. So.
No, I think it's a great question. Basically, the role of empathy in compassion fatigue. I'm trying to decide how much to answer now and how much to wait to jump ahead. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the neurobiology of what happens with empathy in a few slides, which I think will answer that. And if I don't, stop me and we'll delve a little bit deeper. But I think it's a great question because that is really where the compassion fatigue component comes in, right? The empathy is the ability to feel what other people are feeling. You're really experiencing their trauma, their stress as your own. And there is a biological basis for that, which ups the ante a lot. And we'll look at that, but it really is why you end up feeling the compassion fatigue, at feeling like oftentimes you have nothing left because you've given it all. A lot of times, one of the downsides and dangers of compassion fatigue too is, one, you may have nothing left for home. A lot of people give at work and home ends up in the negative, essentially, with your capacity for compassion fatigue. And then also, when you're past that point where compassion fatigue is really like set in and you're in it, you aren't giving to your clients in a way that you maybe want to, in terms of like being an ideal like lawyer, an ideal person, the version of yourself you want to be. You do almost naturally turn it off because you have nothing left. But there are consequences to that, right? You may stop paying attention to the stories that they're telling you because you can't hear it anymore, right? Like, I don't have the capacity to listen to one more sad, horrible situation. So your brain almost automatically stops doing it for you. You're not necessarily even conscious of the fact that you're doing it. It's the survival mechanism that's kicked in. Go ahead.
Something that I notice is that I pick up on it doesn't always relate to how like sad their case is or how dramatic it is. Even clients who have kind of like more standard cases or business visa cases, I feel like I pick up on their stress level and their worry about their case and about their future. And then I have a natural tendency to feel that way myself. So then when I pick up on it from my clients, it leaves my mind feeling like kind of scrambled. And then I feel like paralyzed sometimes as to, okay, I know I have to do this next step, but I internalize their worries, and then it takes root in myself. And I know that it's good to understand how your clients feel, because then you can talk to them and give them like the services, maybe extra help that they need. But then when it starts to affect my ability to work efficiently, that's not fun. So, anybody else ever have that experience? You can just raise your hand. Yes. So most of the room is raising their hand, just so you know. Right? It's very normal. So it's a concept of emotional contagion is really essentially what that is, right? When I sit, we talk about this a lot. There are two other therapists in the Lawyer Assistance Program, right? So we talk about this a lot. I'll have a client leave and I'll be like, I feel awful. Like, I just want to shake it off, right? Like, I feel this thing that I did not feel when I went into that session, whether it's anxiety or depression or like whatever it is, I just feel it. And
that's the best way I can describe it. I just want to shake it off. But it's a concept of emotional contagion, essentially, that we have the ability to feel what other people are feeling. And if we aren't aware of it, and if we don't kind of take some actions to release it, to let go of it, we'll internalize it, and then it will actually become our own feelings, right? We'll become anxious, stressed, worried, upset, sad, like whatever that is, we'll feel it. It's also, on the flip side, useful when people are feeling good, right? Like, so if you walk into a room and people are really happy and celebratory, you actually start to feel that too, which is something to be conscious of how much like positive emotion we're also exposing ourselves to. I'm gonna stop there because I'm definitely delving into the neurobiological like pieces, which I'll talk about in just one second. But so 3 areas of impact to think about with the compassion fatigue is, so hyperarousal, which is what you were talking about, essentially that my system has been awoken by somebody else. So I might be irritable or angry, I might have increased anxiety, I might have difficulty concentrating or making decisions. Sleep can be impacted. So we'll talk about the neurobiological system in a couple minutes. And then another component can be like intrusive symptoms, which is that vicarious trauma component. So disturbing images, bad dreams, an inability to let go of work, compulsive desire to help clients, maybe above and beyond what you have learned is necessary and or appropriate, or to the point where it's interfering in other areas of your life or interfering in other cases. And then there's avoidance symptoms, which are kind of like procrastinating, avoiding aspects of the case, right? I've definitely had plenty of clients who've gotten in trouble, disciplinary trouble. Sometimes they'll have to come to us as part of their case, but where they're not answering phones, emails, mail, because they just can't deal with that particular client or that particular aspect of the case. Dreading working with certain clients or dreading working with certain parts of the client's case. More kind of withdrawing from other people. Chronically, over time, you could start to see self-medication in some capacity, whether with drugs or alcohol, or like other compulsive behaviors, shopping, being on the internet all the time because it's like an easy, quick escape. But those are all kind of things just to be aware of. And like I said, they're in the handouts, so it's something you can think about or take to kind of self-inventory if you want. So I think we've gone over this in terms of common elements, but one of the ones I want to point out is the cynicism about life. So this is kind of where compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma has really settled in. It changes the way you feel about the world. So cynicism about life, numbness, or a feeling that nothing a person does really matters. That's in the spectrum. It's further down on the spectrum, so you don't have to get there, but if you don't intervene, it's likely that you will. So just kind of more emphasis on the burnout versus compassion fatigue is compassion fatigue also goes where you go, right? So unless you address it and do something with it, just because you've changed jobs doesn't mean it's going to go away because there's something internal going on for you. You've started to think about the world differently, feel about the world differently. It will help. I'm not saying it's not a factor, but there is more to it than just the workplace itself. Yep.
Niki, on that point, if you change jobs and you have a different client base, do you still have compassion fatigue for your new client base? Or is that what you're saying, is that it goes with...
Thank you. Yeah, yes. So essentially, let's say you went from immigration law to tax law, to make something a little drier. That there is the potential your compassion fatigue will still exist if you've done nothing to address it. Like if I've done nothing to take care of myself, I'm already spent, right? I haven't actually plugged, if we go the battery metaphor, I haven't plugged my battery back in. So while it won't be being drained in the same way, unless I recharge it, that compassion fatigue is kind of going to stay with me. Does that make sense? And then these are just responses to trauma, essentially. So things to think about what you might see, but it's about transformations within ourselves that we notice. They may be a little hard to, are they hard to see? Yeah. All right. So feeling helpless and hopeless, a sense that one can never do enough, hypervigilance, diminished creativity, inability to embrace complexity, minimizing, chronic exhaustion or physical ailments, inability to listen, deliberate avoidance, disassociative moments, sense of persecution, guilt, fear, anger and cynicism, inability to empathize and numbing, addictions or grandiosity, an inflated sense of importance related to one's work. Do any of these sound familiar to anyone, whether or not you've witnessed them in yourself or maybe other people? Lots of head nods. So again, it comes back to today is really foundationally about like raising your awareness, thinking about this in yourself and others too, right? Because others' compassion fatigue impacts you. All right, so talking about the neurological basis of compassion fatigue. There are really two main factors. So there's mirror neurons and the sympathetic nervous system, which we'll both break down in just a minute. The reason I want this in here and that I think it's really important is it's not you making this up, right? Like there's a real physiological component to what happens to us when we experience others' stress, and even in our own stress, which we'll talk about. It's a stress, it's basically compassion fatigue is a stress reaction that's neurologically based and completely normal. It doesn't mean it's not something that we have to address. You know, our brains are, one of the things we have to remember is our brains are wired essentially to regulate us for survival. They are not they're not wired to make us happy. That's not really the brain's goal. It would be nice if that was the case, but from a biological survival mechanism, they're just meant for us to live to the next day. And once we feel safe, we can start to think about happy. But if we're not feeling safe and our body doesn't recognize that we're safe, we can't focus on the things that make us happy or feel pleasure or any of those other things. All right, so mirror neurons. The best way to describe them is, you know, that sensation when you have when you're watching somebody do something, like if you see somebody pricked by a needle, you can kind of like feel it. That's the mirror neurons kind of at work. You're feeling what they feel. The neurons give us the ability to feel empathy for another person, to imagine ourselves in that situation, enduring the exact same experience. So it works both emotionally and physically, which I find really interesting in terms of, so if I'm sitting with a client and the client crosses her legs, I might then cross my legs, and I don't even like intentionally do it. It is we watch somebody do something, and we actually do it ourselves. Somebody touches their face, we touch our face. They actually first found it in monkeys. They witnessed monkeys doing it with each other, and that's where they kind of realized mirror neurons came from. And then they took it up a level looking at humans and kind of the way we feel what other people are feeling. But it's involved in empathy for kind of pain is really where mirror neurons come into play, right? So coming back to the biological basis, if I see somebody else in pain, I feel that pain. My body reacts to the pain, and I know not to do that pain, right? So it's this hard wiring to teach us to avoid danger. Does that make sense? But that's where that empathy component comes in, is no matter what kind it is. So it's just, and it doesn't matter how you're doing it. So you can be observing the action, you can be hearing the story, or you can be reading about the story. So kind of any way we're inputting data into our brain, we can experience the pain. It can vary for different people. Everybody has different levels of empathy. Some people have stronger or more empathic than others. So it's really important to know where you are kind of on that scale and how much you can consume. Any questions about the mirror neurons? Nope. All right, so then it's mirror neurons plus our sympathetic nervous system, right? So this is the fight, flight, freeze response that happens for everybody. And everybody has it. Some people are more sensitive than others. Again, it comes back to we're just individuals. But primal coping mechanism, right? Hardwired for survival. It kicks in when we feel threatened. The catch is we feel threatened when we witness other people feeling threatened, right? So I don't have to actually be threatened or feel in danger for my system to kick in. I actually just need to think that it might be existing, and that's where the mirror neuron piece is. So when this system's activated, you're not very good at details or like small things. Your brain just can't, right? It is worried about, tiger, can I get away, not get away? It's not worried about, is that the right wording in this document? Any questions about that? Okay. All right, so that's the neurobiological basis of where compassion fatigue comes from. Now we're going to talk about some other risk factors. So we have individual vulnerabilities, which is what we can kind of look at for ourselves, but it's really important to recognize the individual, right, life situation and organizational factors. And societal, I think there should be like a fourth component, because like societal is also an important factor, whether it's natural disasters or shootings or freedoms at risk, whatever that is going on in the society, that is another thing that is contributing and influencing your vulnerability to compassion fatigue. And everybody's vulnerability looks different, right? We all have different upbringings, we all have different experiences, different belief systems, whatever that is. But we need to kind of know what our own set of vulnerabilities are if we're going to do something with them and about them and protect ourselves. Because at the end of the day, this is all about protecting ourselves. We can't make the cases go away. We can't change some of the societal factors. And sometimes we can't change the organizational factors, right? Heavy caseloads, long hours, inefficient like administration, inadequate resources sometimes to meet demands, unknown, right? Like things are changing constantly. So I can't control that. I don't know what's going to come down the pike tomorrow. I don't know if the rules are going to be different tomorrow. So I can't protect myself against that. I have to protect myself in the other ways that I can. Any questions? Everybody still awake? Relatively? Yes? Okay. One of the things to think about here is also the importance of having a non-work identity, right? So you can't just be a lawyer. It's just not healthy, actually. In terms of if you're talking about protective factors, right? And particularly if you're talking about you're in a particularly stressful period, if you don't have an identity outside of work, there is no relief from the stress and the trauma that you experience. So we'll talk about it in a little bit, but it's really about building up also a non-work identity, which I know is not easy, and I know there are a lot of other factors that contribute to that, so I don't want to make something sound easier than it is. I fully recognize that that can be really challenging, but it is really essential and important. Some of the mitigating factors can be having, good supervision or support from the workplace or other peers. Looking at the volume and diversity of your caseload or workload, right? So having, from what you can control, having some variety, or looking at how you schedule even like meeting with clients. If you have 5 difficult clients, don't meet them all the same day if you can help it. Spread them out throughout the week. They're really small things to think about, and we don't often think about. We kind of just go with the flow without being intentional about our decision making. But I know there are certain clients for me that I can't have 3 or 4 back-to-back incredibly intense clients. It's just, I won't have anything left for the next client that comes. So if I can spread them out throughout the day or spread them out throughout the week, it serves me better, and at the end of the day, it serves my clients better. So if you can think about the incremental things that you can do, that's really important. Has anybody ever tried that? See some nods? Mm-hmm.
I feel like one issue, particularly with people who do like removal, I don't do business, so I'm sure it's the same exact thing, just in a different form. Mm-hmm. One issue is that like I I do. I know like there are certain groups of people or certain people that take a lot of my energy, so I try to schedule those individually because that's what I have control over. But even though, so like I have a small firm with a partner, but most of our cases are asylum, and so it's really, I feel like a lot of us, I'm guessing a lot of us feel the same way. It's really hard to like find a variety when that's like what your niche is.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested to hear.
Has anybody
Thoughts
else
on
figured
that?
out how to do that? Or had thoughts about, experimented at all with what to do? Not yet? I think you raise a very important point, right? Like a lot of times my cases are my cases, and that is just what they are. It is instead of then, right, I can't control the clients themselves. What then I have to look at is how am I scheduling them, right? So do I do a full day of clients, like, meetings back to back? Is that something I have the capacity for? Can I meet like 2 clients, take lunch, literally leave the building to take lunch, even if it's 20 or 30 minutes, take a walk, come back, meet with 2 more clients? So it's really looking at, if I can't control the type of clients I'm going to have, can I control what my schedule looks like throughout the day? Again, acknowledging that is not easy. But it is important to look at kind of so thinking about my battery, right? Like I've now been drained by 3 clients. I'm kind of at the low end. What are some things that actually make me feel better? Do I call a friend and just talk for 10 or 15 minutes? Do I take a walk? Do I do some meditation? Do I do chair yoga? Do I listen to some peppy music because that makes me feel better? A podcast that is uplifted, whatever that is for you. But thinking about, and we'll talk a little bit later, you almost have like a toolbox of things that recharge you and going to that throughout your day. Whether it's in 5-minute or 10-minute increments, it doesn't have to be a lot, but you do need the break. Does that? Charity?
I would add too, from a practice management perspective, some attorneys hire folks that essentially insulate them from the sort of more traumatic side of the client representation. So the paralegal will be the main point of contact. So sometimes that's a route, though not always great in a tiny firm. So.
Another idea, if you do focus on asylum cases, is maybe to have a certain part of your practice doing appeals. So then you're not like, you lessen the amount of like direct client sort of court preparation and client contact that you need to have. And then also maybe targeting some other countries or parts of the world. If you have a lot of clients that are all coming from the same few countries, that can get really old, tiresome. So finding people who have different kinds of claims, I think, could also, if you don't want to switch and add more practice areas of other types of immigration practice, I think that's a way to have some balance.
Thank you.
One of the challenges that I have is doing the client intakes. I have a paralegal who does all the intakes for me, and then she'll email me a quick summary. And a lot of times it's a question that maybe I can answer in 5 or 10 minutes of talking to the client. But a lot of times I just simply don't have the time to do a detailed consult without being paid for. And so now I turn away a lot of these people because they don't want to pay for the consult. And then I end up feeling bad that, oh, I'm a bad person. Like I'm just greedy for the money. And it's a tension that I have.
Anybody else felt that tension? Or do you need it repeated at all? So, right, the tension essentially, it's sometimes we have to turn away clients for the financial security of our own practice. Is that? But there is the part of you that is a helper that says, I want to help other people. This is like what I do. And who am I to like turn people away who need help? Is that? Yeah, up front. Oh, we have an up front.
So I used to feel that way, and I think now I've swung kind of far to the other side of the pendulum, where clients who want free advice just aggravate me, or not even clients, potential clients just aggravate me. And I think, you know, if you don't want to pay for my time for a consultation, then I'm not the lawyer for you. And that there's plenty of other lawyers out there and other organizations that can serve those people. And I feel like I don't want to waste my time with somebody like that. If it's somebody who was referred to me by an existing client or another attorney, I would maybe approach them differently. But if it's especially just a random person, I don't want to. My energy is limited, and you know, if you're running a firm, you have to think about your financial obligations. So I think it's actually a smart thing to do, because then it gives you more of the resources to help the clients who are actually the right clients for you and your firm. But I would also say, if you feel bad about that, about turning people away who seem to be, you know, reaching out to you, maybe have, you know, half a day of like free mini consults that you give like once every few months, where you might open up your office and say, hey, today is whatever you want to call it, like free mini consultation day, and you've got 15 minutes to talk to me. And it could also be a good marketing tool, because then maybe some of those people would actually want to hire you for something or pay for a more detailed consultation.
Thank you. Did it take some time to get there? Like to get
time to get there?
Yeah. Was it a process for you at all? No.
Well, for me, just the reality of having to pay bills, because I also have my own firm, I'm a solo. So just the reality of having to pay bills just was, I think that just got me there.
The value became higher, right? I mean,
right. And I think it was when you have to deal with, I think the issue of running a practice and dealing with clients who maybe don't have the money to pay, or who don't want to pay, or who want to negotiate too much. For me, I think it's an issue of boundaries, and setting those boundaries for yourself, and then knowing when to stick with them. And sometimes, you know, I might go against my better judgment and give a discount, or agree to a payment plan that maybe financially isn't so smart, but I'm at least aware now of when I do it, because I don't want to. I think if we get caught up in situations like that, where the financial dealings with the client causes us more stress, then that causes me at least to resent the client, and then I resent working on their case, and that's not good for them either. Right. So I think I've been learning from my, I won't say mistakes, but my experiences with clients with, you know, who didn't pay on time. And I try to identify, okay, are there similarities between, like, how can I recognize that from the beginning? Yeah. So I have a good radar system to weed out those clients. And I feel like it's just, but that's just me, and that's how I run my practice, because I'm a solo. So it's not always a good match between attorney and client. There's plenty of potential clients out there. There's plenty of immigration lawyers out there, and there will be somebody who meets that person's need, and doesn't have to be us. We're not responsible for helping everybody and fixing all the problems of the world. But I've been doing this for over 20 years, so that's maybe a little bit of cynicism, but it's like reality, I think.
Well, it's actually a pretty good coping mechanism. Like, it's a very healthy coping mechanism, right? Because throughout our career and our lives, not just our career, right? You will always be in tension with values. So my values will come in tension with each other, because it's sometimes one value has to take, or one priority has to take, you know, ranks above another. So helping others and my financial stability are both important values to me, right? That doesn't mean I can always do both all the time. And it will come back to looking at, okay, well, what is my value right now, and what's most important to me? So if the roof over my head at the end of the day is the most important thing, it's going to have to win. And it's okay that I feel bad that it wins, right? It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It actually is just a human experience. Like suffering isn't a human experience. That is just kind of what it is. And I think a lot of times we take information when we feel bad about something and we judge it and we say that that's not the right thing to do because it doesn't feel like good. But it really is just life. Like I don't want to sound flippant in any capacity, right? But there is suffering in life, and there is suffering because we make choices, and every choice has a consequence. And it's not to diminish them at all, but it is to make sure, as long as we're making choices that are in line with our values and our meaning and our purpose, within limits, right? Like we have limits with whatever that is. There is this concept in Acceptance and Commitment Therapy ACT is this way of kind of the goal in this therapy is essentially like moving towards a more meaningful and purposeful life. Not happiness, but like a meaningful and purposeful life. And there's this point where it's called a choice point, and you can move towards meaning or purpose, or you can move away from meaning and purpose and your values. Who is the person that I want to be? How do I want to be in the world? What type of lawyer do I want to be? What are my priorities? Like, do I have a family? Do I have friends? Do I have, other outside obligations? And that decision, am I moving towards that person or away from that person? And sometimes moving towards something means letting go of something else. And that will just be something over time to kind of figure out for ourselves what our own limitations are. A great example I know for myself is I have a 2.5-year-old. So before I had him, I volunteered a ton more than I do now. And I just had to acknowledge that there is a phase in my life right now where my capacity is more limited than it was, and he has taken precedence over some of the other things I used to do. And that doesn't mean volunteer opportunities don't come up and I'm like, oh, I'd really like to do that. But that would mean I wouldn't get to see my son today. So is it worth it today, right? Like that doesn't necessarily feel good. I want to go help other people. But it's, well, he is my number one priority for the most part. So that wins and this other one loses, essentially. And I feel a little bit bad, and that's okay. Does that? I'm not sure if any of that was useful, but that's what it is. All right, so dealing with compassion fatigue, essentially, we need tools to help us process the material. We need tools to figure out kind of to mitigate the compassion fatigue. So now we talked about what it is, where it comes from. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about how do we mitigate it. So I'm going to have you take a moment and flip on the backside of your battery if you have some space. And if you need another battery, there are other batteries to be given. Anybody else need a room? All right. So we're going to take a couple minutes and take a non-judgmental inventory of where things are in your life. So make a list of all the demands on your time and energy. Work, family, home, health, volunteering, anything that comes up, both positive and draining. There's no judgment in them, but write them all within the scope of the plate. So an example, like under work, you might say like the number of clients you have, the amount of paperwork you have, the difficult colleague or boss or whatever it might be, but really break down like tasks is the best way I could describe it, categorically, but like tasks on your plate, in your plate, I guess would be the best. The whole point is you can't make changes and improvements without kind of knowing the problem areas. I would imagine as lawyers you're pretty good at gathering data and then putting forward a plan. That's really what we're going to talk about right now in terms of mitigating. But so if anybody let's start actually. What's your stress level after having lifted it? Did it elevate at all? Yeah. So some people exponentially it elevated, right? Which is really important to know, to say, this is my plate is overflowing often for many people. And it's starting to take some time to think about what are things that are there things that can be delegated? Are there things I can say no to? Are there more things I need to be saying yes to because my plate is too XY heavy? this is a process. This is not meant to be done overnight, but it is to start kind of getting you thinking. Am I on some committee that I don't really need to be on? Am I baking cookies for the bake sale that I could just go buy? Whatever that is. They can be really small, but it is important to really look at those things. I'm going to actually have you guys take a second. We're going to do a quick, put your feet on the floor, pens down, because everybody said their stress level went up. Another quick thing you can do is really just like a 4x4 breathing exercise, which is you're going to breathe in for the count of 4. You're going to hold for the count of 4. Exhale for the count of 4, and then hold out for the count of 4. We'll kind of run through it a couple times to get the sense of it. All right, so I'm going to, on my count, breathe. And it's breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. So in through your nose, 1, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. One more, in through your nose, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, mouth out, 3, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, and 4. All right, how's everybody doing? You can do that for 60 seconds, and it goes back to shutting down your sympathetic nervous system and turning on your parasympathetic nervous system. It doesn't take much. I think it's really easy to remember 4x4. You can do any kind of deep breathing. There is no right way to do deep breathing. I think it's easy to remember, and I found it really interesting because I was reading about, in a Brene Brown book, I was reading that she did this interview with the military, and I think it was the Army Rangers, and they do that before they go into like missions, because it really is like scientifically the way to calm your nervous system down. All right, so this is one of the things, like this is the inventory. Does anybody want to look at anything that stood out? What made their plate too full? Life situations, things you've taken on? Anything you want to change? It's okay if nobody wants to share. Did everybody's plate feel too full? I see head nods, head nods. Anybody's plate didn't feel too full? Yeah. All right. Yes. We have up front.
Thank you. I will say that it did feel helpful to make a list, and I constantly have to-do lists and other lists that I work off of. It's overwhelming to think about all these things all at once, but making a list and just putting it helped to lessen the feeling of overwhelm, because it's all, or not maybe
it's
not
somewhere.
all of it, but it's there. You can look at it. And then I divided my list into work related and then like home, like personal related. So it helped to take different things and put them into those categories. So then it makes it easier to try to
Figure out what to do. Yeah.
Plan how to deal with them.
And that's really the goal, is to kind of take this inventory and then do something with the information. That's what the goal of talking about over the next 20 minutes or so that we have left is like assessing yourself, assessing what your situation is, and then figuring out what you specifically need. It's not what the neighbor, it's not what your neighbor, it's not what your colleague, it's not what your peers need. It's what you need, because you need something that's going to be different than what other people need. And remembering that is really important. So these are some research-based suggestions, which I'm going to break down as we kind of go over, but I wanted to summarize them in one spot so you can kind of go back to them in the handouts, which you should have in your email. So recognize risks for yourself. So we talked about, like, earlier on the sheet in terms of risk factors. So individual vulnerabilities. Do you have some health problems going on? Do you have some family stressors? Are you caretaking a parent? Are you caretaking a child? Is there a history of trauma? Is there, are there financial insecurities? Whatever those vulnerabilities are, they're important for you to be aware of them because they put you at kind of greater risk. So just know that for yourself. The next one is find a way to debrief distressing material. I'll go more in depth to that in the next slide. But more often we informally debrief distressing material. We talk to the colleague, we talk to our significant other, we talk to whomever it is, we talk to somebody kind of in conversation rather than like a set down supervised conversation group. But it's actually recommended to do both informally and formally if possible. And in a regular way. And then there are a couple tools in terms of debriefing, I guess. There's this concept called like a poison letter, which is this concept of you'd have to set aside a significant chunk of time, 40, 50 minutes, which I recognize is a lot. It may not take that long, but you want to give yourself freedom to express as much as you want. And you essentially write down all of the things that are overwhelming you, worrying you, traumatizing you, all of the like fears and concerns that you have, and putting them on paper. There is something about our brain releases a little bit when we write it out. It is actually different than typing. You can type, it is like second best because you're still doing something with it, but there is the physiological process is useful for the brain in terms of pen to paper. So you put everything down on paper, as long as it takes. It could take 10 minutes, it could take 50 minutes. As long as it takes, you get kind of everything out, and then you do something with it. You create a ritual around it, whether that is, and the ritual is intended essentially to tell kind of the universe, for lack of a better word, that like it's not serving you anymore. Like the trauma, this information, it's not useful to me. It's not serving me. Some people, I was reading about it, some people, kind of have said some sort of prayer or meditation for themselves and like burned it. Some people just shredded it, in a electronic shredder or physically. One person actually put it in a balloon and like released it into the air. So whatever it is for you, it doesn't matter because it's your own ritual, but the point is it's a way of like releasing kind of the toxins inside. There are a lot of different things you can do with it. And a really simple thing you can do at the end of the day is really just to journal, to release everything at the end of your day so you're not storing it in your head. So debriefing. Working on self-awareness. So coming back to kind of the battery, the plate, those questions that we asked in the beginning of, here's my worldview, how am I feeling, the fill in the blank questions. Creating a way to check in with yourself to know where you are. And then because that information tells you what you need to do that day with it. Take an inventory of how balanced your life is. Be intentional about balancing it out. Looking at, do I have a healthy rhythm to my daily life? Am I getting most of my needs met? We all have kind of the same category of needs. They just look different in each category, right? We have physical needs, we have emotional needs, we have spiritual needs, we have intellectual needs, we have occupational needs. They just might look different. How they play out looks different for us. But to be well, we all have those categories that we need to hit. Let's see. Evaluate your tension-reducing behaviors. So that's something like 4x4 breathing, the yoga, the meditation, forms of exercise, talking to other people, whatever it is, knowing what your tools are for reducing your stress response. And then being intentional about protecting yourself. So taking concerted efforts to care for yourself, to do what's in your control. Seeking help when needed is a really big one that is a huge barrier for a lot of people, particularly for helpers. Helpers rarely ask for help from other people. We should do it more. there isn't any harm in doing so. It is actually useful for yourself and for others, but recognizing if that's a barrier for you too. And boundaries, which we talked about, kind of covers all of them, right? It is essential to have healthy boundaries, and if you're struggling with healthy boundaries, getting some help around that. All right, so the debriefing. This is something to think about. They talk a lot about in compassion fatigue work, is sliming other people. I am completely guilty of it. I definitely, as I'm like reading this, I was like, I've definitely done that. The concept is when we informally debrief with other people, right? So if I walk into my colleague's office and I'm like, oh my God, you won't believe the case that I just had, and then spew kind of everything that just happened, all the traumatic, gory details, she's now just been traumatized. It's not just me that's been traumatized, she's now traumatized. And it doesn't mean stop sharing, but it does think about doing it in a more conscious way, because if your colleagues are also doing that to you, right, it's not just your cases that you might feel stressed and traumatized about, it's now their cases. I've now just heard a story that maybe is even more triggering to me than it was for them. Right? Maybe I have my own personal history that really hits something for me that I find really hard to hear. I spent several years doing family therapy with foster care children who had behavioral issues, which means they just had more trauma than other foster care kids. So kids are a really sensitive thing for me. I spent a number of years doing that. I definitely got a lot of compassion fatigue and had to kind of reevaluate. So while a story about, I don't know, maybe in certain asylum stories would be really traumatizing, but not as triggering to my vulnerabilities as if it's a child's asylum story. So just kind of knowing for yourself what that is and where your trigger points are is really important. And then in terms of the debriefing, so it's essentially this concept of asking, right? That's it. So going into my colleague's office and saying, hey, do you have 10 minutes? I just had this really tough case and I'd like to talk about it. And then they get to decide whether or not that's okay for them. And they might be able to say, yeah, I have 10 minutes, I'm really happy to listen, or I have 10 minutes, but if it's about kids, I just don't think I can hear that right now. So there's more, it's about kind of empowering yourself and the other person to hear the story. And then also, as you talk about the story, there's a concept of starting from the outer circle and moving inwards in terms of the details. So can I just tell you kind of the cursory parts that were challenging for me? Do I need to tell you all of the specific details about the story that I just heard? Sometimes you do, but not always. So kind of starting big and moving small. Conceptually. There's more out there. It's called low impact debriefing if kind of you want to do some more research on it. But so the importance of informal and formal debriefing. When you're doing informal debriefing, ideally working towards low impact debriefing if you can, for yourself and for other people. It will not always happen. I still don't always do it. I do try to be conscious, but it's life and that's what happens. We're not perfect. And then one of the other things to really think about is finding more structured, formal debriefing. Whether that's, if you're, a solo or a small practice, meeting up with a couple of other solos intentionally, right? So having a time set aside every week, every other week, once a month, whatever it is that you're capable of doing, and saying, all right, this is a time and period, we're gonna talk about these really stressful cases and how they've impacted me. Because it's really useful to talk to somebody else, one, because you're getting it out, and then it's really normalizing to hear how everybody else has also had these experiences and are having trouble with it. And or supervision if you feel like you need supervision. Mentoring is another way to kind of reduce at least the occupational stress and strain, to see what other people have done and how they've handled it is really important. So the whole point of the debriefing component is not to do this by yourself. And if you don't have any other way, finding a therapist to help you with that is a very viable option. Any questions? All right. So compassion fatigue. all coming back to self-awareness, which is what we've talked about in all of these different inventories, right? But knowing your specific warning signs. Develop an early warning system, which is kind of concept that I like, and they talk a lot about in the literature, is knowing on a scale of 1 to 10 where I am today. So 1 is the best day I've ever had at work. 10 is I want to move to an island and never be seen again. Like, where are you today? If I'm in, if I'm high, if I'm in 8, okay, well, what's going on and what do I need to do? Do I need to stop taking new cases? Do I need to take a day off? Do I need to see a therapist? What is it that I can do that could move me back down to a 7, down to a 6? And it's about experimenting. You're not going to know right away, but it does mean you should kind of start trying to figure out what is useful to move you up and down the scale. And in terms of the early warning signs, okay, well, so my best friend just asked me out to dinner and I feel too drained, too tired, I don't want to talk to her. That might be a warning sign, right? Like, what's going on that one of the people I'm most comfortable with that usually gives me energy and I don't have any desire to see her? Is it really just that today was hard, or is there something more going on? So think about like the warning signs for yourself, what those might be, to move you up and down the scale. Questions? The handout, I'm gonna give out the self-inventory, but we'll make it pretty quick. So I know we're doing a lot of self-assessment today, but that really is the only way to kind of move forward. So I want you guys to kind of peruse this relatively quickly, because it talks about tools that we have. So assessing what your tools are in kind of the different areas of life. And if you don't finish it right now, that's okay. I'm probably just going to give like 60 seconds because time. So I know you've just started, and I apologize, but you can take it home and finish it. Even just if you got through 1 or 2 categories, is there anything that stood out to you that you noticed? Are you doing things you want to do? Are there more things you would like to be doing?
So I just find it interesting. So I randomly also teach yoga on the side, and I teach like 3 classes a week, and I feel conflicted a lot of times because it adds to my plate. And obviously when I need to get those shifts covered, because it is a job, I can't just like not show up, or I'm going somewhere, or I happen to be really busy at my actual like firm that day or whatever, it stresses me out. But I also feel like without it, I would go insane. And it's a part of me that I really like and a part of me that I really appreciate. So I think it's just
The tension.
Yeah.
That there is often tension in areas in how we take care of ourselves, essentially. Anybody else? Thank you. All right, so I'm going to send that home with you. Kind of look at it. Think about areas that you are doing well in. A lot of times, what I notice is more often the physical is kind of the easiest to take care of, and some of the other areas we don't do as well in. Not always true, but that seems to be the trend that I notice. But all of those categories are important, right? So self-care should be tailored to your own areas of vulnerability, which is what we come back to. That's really important to, I know I'm using tons of metaphors, right? Like batteries, filling your cup. All of these are important, though. The imagery is really important. You cannot pour from an empty cup. It is not possible. So if you have nothing left to give because you're not filling up, you're not doing an adequate service to yourself, to your clients, or to anybody else in your life. And it kind of comes back to self-care is foundational in terms of building resilience. I struggle with the self-care word because it gets all sorts of connotations right now today. It's been a little bit made prettier, like in terms of, right, am I doing a face mask or taking a bath? But that's not really, that is self-care, but that's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about, am I doing all the things to get my own needs met in all areas of my life? That's really what self-care is. One of the best things I've read about, like the best form of self-care is saying no or yes. that's self-care. Like, am I allotting my time in a way that gives me energy? Or am I only draining myself in terms of the time I spend? So thinking about self-care in a much larger context and larger scale than maybe how it's always used today. All right, so this is in your handouts, but I think it's really useful to think about. We won't spend time on it, but this talks about kind of before, during, right after, and later ongoing in terms of around the like self-compassion trauma piece. So this is ideally almost kind of what it looks like at each stage of the journey, right? So you're practicing physical self-care, you're looking at transitions to work, transitions around like the trauma, talking about scheduling, right? Can I schedule 2 or 3 clients and then take a break? Knowing my triggers, grounding in. I'm going to stop because I will want to go further and we don't have time for it. But it is in your handout, and it's just something to get you thinking kind of, and think about where you are on that journey too. All right, so some additional ideas just in terms of increasing well-being. Very small things, right? Taking a break from your environment. Whether it's the walk or like taking a break on a weekend to get out in nature is really important and useful for most people, they find. Study after study shows that. Whatever kind of nature you like, it can be a simple walk in Rock Creek Park. It doesn't have to be big. You don't have to hike a mountain. But figure out what that looks like for you. Gardening can be nature, you know. Hugging someone that loves you, that's a big one. Research, boosts your immune system, reduces stress. Listening to your favorite song, having like a go-to playlist when you're really struggling can be useful. Figuring out what those songs are for you, it's kind of an immediate mood lifter. One of the things that's on my like self-care toolbox or whatever is I pick up my son from daycare and we'll come home and like put on some music, and he loves to like dance and sing, and that immediately like reduces some of the stress that I felt throughout the day. But like figuring out what those are for you. Moving your body can really change your mind. So don't wait until you want to move your body, because you might be waiting a long time. But if you're noticing that your mind is stuck, moving your body can unstick your mind, essentially. And I think this is just a nice kind of way to end and leave you thinking, is small things like this. So what do I do at the end of the workday, right? How am I transitioning from work to home? Because it's a concrete way to kind of leave what I'm doing. Even if you have to pick it back up later, think about what transitions look like for you. They talked about also transitions from like the trauma point. So if I'm transitioning to having to go listen to somebody's story or meet with a client that I know is challenging, how am I going to prepare myself going in? And then how am I going to take care of myself when I leave? And creating kind of plans and rituals around that for yourself. And this is my very last thing, I promise, and then I'll stop. This is for your own thing to think about. It's in the handouts. But keeping a record of meaningful like cases, clients, compliments, successes, whatever that is for you can be really important too. Because when you're feeling like you're not getting anywhere, whether you're losing the cases, you're stuck in uncertainty, you're just not feeling good about yourself as a lawyer, it's really useful to have this like archive that you can go to and say, oh yeah, I've helped these people, I've done these things, right? I have an email folder that essentially like of emails clients have sent me thanking me, and I have a concrete folder of like cards clients have given me, because if I have a bad day and I'm like, I'm not very good at what I do, you can go to that and be like, oh, that's right. Like, it was a bad day today, but there are these things that I've done well. And that's really important because we have a negativity bias. We're hardwired to look at the negative. And it is not as easy for us to look at the positive things. So keep something like that, and it's just a really good tool to fall back on. And then it also connects to, why am I doing the work I'm doing? Like, why is this important and purposeful and meaningful? And if you can connect to that regularly, that also really helps. Because helping it's like purpose-driven, right? So if we connect to our purpose, that can also be useful. And I will stop now. Questions, comments? Oh, resources.